Welcome back, everyone. Thank you again to our three speakers and our moderator from the morning session, which really set such a great tone for the rest of our day. I would now like to turn to our second session and welcome our first student and faculty pair, Ambra Spinelli and John Pollini, both joining us from the University of Southern California.
Voila. So my name's John Pollini. I'm professor of classical art, archaeology, and history in the Department of Art History at USC, and it's a great pleasure to introduce today Ambra Spinelli, a PhD candidate specializing in classical antiquity in the Department of Art History at USC. Ambra received her BA in classics and an MA in archaeology from the University of Bologna. Among her awards and accomplishments are an internship at the Getty Villa and a Mellon Digital Humanities Fellowship at USC. She has also served as a research assistant at the Getty for the spectacular Power and Pathos exhibition, co-organized the 19th International Congress on Ancient Bronzes that took place at the Getty Center, and was co-editor of the proceedings of that conference. Over the years, Ambra has participated in a number of excavations in Italy, and from 2011 to the present has served as the head of archival research and assistant to the director of the University of Cincinnati's Pompeii Archaeological Research Project, Porta Stabia. Ambra has also given a number of invited talks and papers at various academic venues and has published several articles. Ambra's talk today, which is based on her dissertation in progress, is titled Spectacle and Society, the Tablinum's Imagery in the Houses of Pompeii and Herculaneum. So please join me now in welcoming Ambra Spinelli.
Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you again, Rebecca and Chelsea, for organizing this, and wonderful meeting so many great scholars. Also, very happy to see so many friends' faces in the audience, so thanks again. My dissertation explores the relationship between Roman domestic activities and social customs by looking at the domestic room known as the tablinum in a large sample of houses at Pompeii and Herculaneum. In particular, I examined the full range of literary and archaeological evidence, such as finds, decoration, architecture, and graffiti, for 172 tablina, through personal survey that I undertook in the summer 2016, 17, and 18, and through the reading of various public and archival sources. The tablinum has been commonly identified as a spacious room opening at the far end of the atrium and opposite to the entrance, thus connected the front and the back of the house. Until today, the tablinum has received insufficient attention in modern scholarship. Earlier studies have focused on the public uses of this space, and in particular has main reception room for the presentation of the pater familias to his clients and friends during the formal morning greeting salutatio. No ancient literary evidence, however, mentions a connection between the salutatio and the tablinum. Such understanding of the tablinum in modern scholarship derives from the archaeologists like August Mau, who at the end of the 19th century described the tablinum as a space where undoubtedly the master of the house received his clients. Past attention to the public uses of the tablinum and the patron-client activities in it have not only discouraged a fuller discussion on this space, but also conditioned the way in which scholars have interpreted its decoration. So today I will focus and concentrate on wall paintings found in this space, and how interpreting them without a focus on the salutatio can offer new interpretation and understanding of the larger social, geographical, and cultural context in which they were created. In particular, I argue that the mythological frescoes often found in tablina attest to the role played by contemporary spectacles and by the social and cultural environment in promoting certain visual tableaux. For the purpose of this talk, I will draw mainly upon paintings from Pompeii to illustrate my points, because there are more numerous and demonstrative examples of Pompeii in comparison with Herculaneum. In this graphic, I present information I gather on the treatment and condition of tablina's walls. The reading of the archival and published sources has been crucial in reconstructing wall decorations, since most of the tablina no longer preserve evidence of their wall paintings. My study indicates that 85 tablina were painted in what is known as the fourth style, and 32 in third style, for a total of 117. A central mythological panel could have been found in any of these two wall schemes, so I will be focusing here only a few examples of these two types of wall styles. Recorded in tablina are a total of 72 central mythological panels, the majority of which are in the first style, which developed around the mid of the 1st century CE. Although figurative panels should not be regarded as thematic reflection of the activities that took place within a room, the mythological scenes found in tablina have been often viewed as reflecting its connection to the morning salutatio, which, as indicated, there is no evidence. The walls of the tablinum in the Casa dei Dioscuri at Pompeii were each painted with a central mythological scene related to the tales of Achilles. On the left wall was a panel showing the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon. On the right, the discovery of Achilles by Odysseus on the island of Skyros. Both paintings are fragmentary, but through comparison with other similar Pompeian images, such as two mosaics in the Casa di Apollo, as we see here, we can reconstruct today their original appearance. Despite admitting the lack of ancient written sources for the use of the tablinum during the salutatio, Jennifer Trimble concluded that such decoration would have reflected the patronage activities that took place within the room. According to Trimble, the painting's thematic focus on the gaze between Achilles and Odysseus would have matched the relationship of reciprocal recognition between a patron and his client. Trimble maintains that after viewing paintings of the twin god of entrances, Castor and Pollux, painted on the walls of the vestibule of this house, a client would have experienced a climatic seeing and being seen relationship between himself and his patron only when he entered into the tablinum with its painting showing the analogous shared gaze of Achilles and Odysseus. Such a symbolic association, according to Trimble, would have been appropriate for the tablinum during the morning salutatio reception between a patron and his client. However, the same pair of mythological subjects is also found in one or possibly two Pompeian houses, but in a different context than the tablinum. In the previously mentioned Casa di Apollo scene here again, for instance, the same scenes appear in two mosaics decorating the walls of the garden portico near the summer triclinium. A fresco with the episode of the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles was also found in the portico of the Temple of Apollo. The myth of Achilles and Odysseus on Skyros in particular becomes extremely popular in Roman art and literature during the 1st century CE and is represented in a number of different rooms, especially in more private rooms like triclinia, so-called dining rooms. In my view, therefore, the presence of this subject in a tablinum need not reflect the public role of this space as setting for the salutationes. Decoration, indeed, does not have to indicate the function of spaces. Rather, it reflects the hierarchical relationship among them. Thus, a paratactic or repetitive decoration is typical of dynamic spaces such as vestibules, atria, and peristyles, which are meant for the distribution of passage of people. Complex figural imagery, instead, is well suited to static rooms such as trabilinia, triclinia, or cubicula, where people were meant to spend time. I'm not denying that the tablinum could have been used for receiving clients. Rather, the point I want to make is that the subject matter of paintings does not itself establish the function of the tablinum as space where the salutationes once actually took place. The emphasis on the public nature of the tablinum as its principal formal reception room has also conditioned other scholars' interpretations. The opinion communis that has emerged is that the mythological paintings often found in tabina should be explained by the representative role of this room, and especially in terms of the moral lessons and values associated with the subject depicted. Accordingly, representation of the divine couples like Mars and Venus, themes commonly found in Roman official art, served to celebrate conjugal affection and alluded to the positive qualities embodied by them respectively, for example, beauty and chastity, manliness and authority, and so on. According to Katharina Lorenz, images of this divine pair depicted in a public room like a tablinum would have reflected the role models and virtues of a proper husband and wife to the family members and visitors admitted to the house. For Jürgen Hotzky, Mars and Venus were particularly popular in the tablinum because it is here that the dominus presented himself to his clients. The pictorial choice of scenes with Mars and Venus recorded in tablina at Pompeii and Herculaneum, 8 in total, has been interpreted as expression of moral virtue. To be sure, mythological paintings with these two divinities could be seen as references the exemplary qualities of an idealized couple that might be perceived by a client as analogous to the relationship of the patron and his wife. However, my systematic analysis of central mythological scenes at Pompeii demonstrate that the pairing of Mars and Venus was a very popular motif, not only in tablina, but also in other domestic rooms typically associated with more private activities, such as cubicula and triclinia. In the Casa di Meleagro, for instance, this divine pair appears depicted 3 times, in a tablinum, in a cubiculum, and in an unidentified room. Scenes with Mars and Venus have been also recorded in civic and public buildings at Pompeii. The same myth, for instance, is found in the quadriporticos of the theaters, in the commercial enterprise at 738, and in the garden restaurant at 8515. In my opinion, therefore, depictions of Mars and Venus in the tablinum need not be explained in terms of the public and official role of the tablinum, where the dominus would have greeted his clients and conducted business with them. The considerable amount of scenes with Mars and Venus in Pompeian wall paintings attests to the popularity of this myth in contemporary local society, especially from the middle of the 1st century CE, since the majority of them are in the 4th style. The question remains, why was this myth so popular in a small provincial town like Pompeii in the 1st century CE? Was it connected to the socio-cultural context in Rome, and in particular to the Augusta propaganda and its legacy? In ancient literature, we also read about the ironical meaning of the tale of Mars and Venus, which encompassed a mythological adulterous love affair. According to the story, Venus cheated on her husband Vulcan with Mars. Vulcan took revenge by fashioning an invisible bronze net that entrapped Mars and Venus in bed in the midst of their sexual activity. He later invited all the gods to witness and mock the adulterous couple, so that, in Ovid's words, the gods laugh, and for a long time this was the most well-known story in all of heaven. The transgressive and humorous aspect of the story may have also contributed to making Mars and Venus a quite popular motif in subject art, in Roman art. As I will discuss in a minute, however, this tale was also a very popular motif in theatrical spectacles such as pantomime, so keep in mind this. Scholars today agree in considering the Roman house as a sort of pinacoteca, whose frescoes would have not only maintained the memory of those myths of the lost Greek and caustic panels of the classical and Hellenistic period, but also acquired new meanings according to the Romans' emulation and reception of the past. Mythological imagery has been especially discussed by scholars in regard to the role of paideia and the practice of ekphrasis, thus connected to the ability of discern, discuss, and provoke intellectual debate among the viewers. An analysis of the connection among mythological paintings, literature, and rhetorical response in the domestic sphere has dominated and still dominates scholarship. Thus, painted in a public room like a tablinum, Greek mythological narratives taken from epic and classical and elegiac poetry would have reflected and advertised the householder's cultural knowledge and his up-to-date participation in an elite culture. What is important to note, however, is the fact that as with the representation of Venus and Mars, many other mythological narratives painted on the walls of tablina are also found in many other private and public spaces at Pompeii. Frescoes with Argos and Io, Phrixus and Elle, or Selene and Endymion, for instance, are found often in civic, commercial, and religious spaces throughout the city. The appearance of mythological imagery in places associated with the lower strata of the society, as we can see here in shops and taverns, has been often discussed in relation to the social and visual language of domestic space and explained as a sort of aspirational luxury. Their presence in commercial and industrial properties, including drinking establishments, workshops, and inns, therefore, may have provided an aura of refined taste. Sometimes it remains difficult to determine whether these scenes belong to an earlier domestic phase of the property or if they corresponded to the conversion of the space from domestic to commercial, according to the new owner's taste and agenda. Either way, such shared mythological imagery indicates that retail outlets were deeply integrated into social and cultural urban life, perhaps imitating that this was not just a matter of aspiration nor imitation of social refinement. In my view, therefore, these mythological scenes may have also recalled to customers' mind the mythological narratives staged in public contemporary performances, thus indicating how visual language was also an expression of urban life, hence not limited to the elite. Whether painted off the walls of a domestic room like a tablinum, a cubiculum, or a triclinium, or of a religious, a civic, or commercial building like a temple, a marketplace, or a food and drinking establishment, these mythological scenes attest to the presence of an emergent visual canon that was familiar to all people from all social classes. In discussing the ubiquitous presence and selection of certain mythological images in Pompeii and Herculaneum, therefore, there is another important element which might have contributed to the widespread popularity of certain mythological iconography. That is, the role played by various public spectacles and by the cultural, social, and local environment in promoting certain visual tableaux among the urban fabric. Different forms of popular theatrical performances might have contributed to the development and dissemination of a mythological visual canon derived from classical tragedy. Myth, indeed, was performed in a variety of media and was deeply integrated into the everyday social and cultural life, from the mythological spectacles staged in the theater to the farcical execution of criminals in the amphitheaters, where the punishment of these criminals was staged as parodies of mythological episodes. So these were very like TV, theatrical, and cinematographic melodramas of today. With two stone theaters built even before Rome had its own, Pompeii offered a wide range of theatrical performances, becoming a prominent center for pantomime during the 1st century CE. Several graffiti, both at Pompeii and Herculaneum, testify to the presence of pantomime troupes and the rival fans clubs, the Paridiani and the Anicetiani, informing us of the wild popularity of this ancient theatrical genre. Pantomime was a silent solo dance in which a masked male actor performed each of the male and female parts, accompanied by an orchestra which sang the words of a libretto. The passion for pantomime, which developed in its canonical Roman form during the Augustan age, led to a real pantomania in the imperial Rome through the centuries. Presenting scenes mostly taken from tragedy, classical tragedy and epic, and especially favoring myths with strong emotional and erotic narratives, pantomime contributed to the spread of theatrical imagery and the cultural lifestyle associated with it, playing a seminal role in educating the masses. Pantomime, indeed, appealed both the highest and lowest segments of the society, entering the lives of people through both public festival and private entertainments. When found in Tablina, images of Mars, Achilles, Admetus, and Dionysus, as well as their respective female counterparts, Venus, Deidameia, Alcestis, and Ariadne, have usually been explained as a reflection of Roman social values, especially in the contemporary construction of sexuality and normative gender roles. The tale of Venus, Dionysus, Achilles, Narcissus, as well as Theseus and the Labyrinth, among many others, were also all staged in pantomime. The subjects of these mythological paintings, therefore, may very well have been influenced by various public spectacles, such as pantomime, which favored tales of passion and erotic adventures. The Roman Ovid poet, indeed, complains that some of his works were performed on pantomime stage, while we know that notable poets like Statius and Lucan wrote pantomime libretti, and that Seneca's tragedies were influenced by such performances. quickly becoming one of the most popular forms of entertainment, especially thanks to its strong emotional charge. Pantomime might have played a similar role in making these classical mythological subjects universally known, appealing, and familiar in the urban context across social boundaries. Because pantomime spoke a visual language appealing to different strata of society and transcending linguistic barriers, it is likely to have contributed to the democratization of mythological narratives. Through hand gestures and body movements which spoke a common language, the pantomime actor was capable of making a cultural repertoire accessible and ubiquitous. This would have been all the more true in Hellenized towns like Pompeii and Herculaneum. Besides pantomime, there were a number of other ways in which inhabitants of Pompeii and Herculaneum would have encountered the Greek myths in their everyday life, such as through the mime and the Atellan comedy. The Atellan comedies, in particular, were a native Italian comic drama that developed outside of Rome and were named after the Oscan town Atella in Campania, which is about 20 miles northern than Pompeii. In a region like Campania, which was exposed over the century to several influences such as Etruscan, Greek, Oscan, and finally Roman, and it was theaters in its various forms was always a popular form of entertainment, we can safely assume that theatrical spectacles played an important part in the creation of an emerging visual canon. In conclusion, until my study, past scholarship excessive focus on the public nature of the tablinum and its use during the salutatio has not only discouraged a fuller discussion on this space, but also conditions in which its decoration has been discussed. While the mythological frescoes often found in tablina have usually been considered in terms of the moral lessons supposedly associated with them, I argue that both contemporary spectacles and the social and cultural environment may have also played an important, if not dominant, role in the promotion of mythological visual tableau. To be clear, while spectacles and pantomime would explain the popularity of mythological subjects, this does not preclude that certain mythological subjects were being chosen for display in a home for reasons like husband and wife relationship. What I aim to demonstrate, however, is that the figurative imagery within the tablinum, when compared with the mythological scenes found in different buildings across the city, inform us of a common visual vocabulary shared by different strata of the society, reflecting the cultural and historical environment and taste in which it circulated. In an Hellenized area like Campania, in particular, the long passion for various genres of theatrical spectacles that brought on stage mythical themes may have contributed to the widespread and democratization of such repertoire. By the end of the 1st century BC, pantomime, like gladiatorial combats and stage animal hunts, became a mass media capable of drawing an extensive crowd. Such mythological paintings, together with theaters, amphitheaters, inscription, and all forms of visual art showing theatrical and sporting imagery, demonstrate a spectacle culture and the impact that such contemporary entertainments had in ancient people's everyday lives. These paintings, in my view, are also an expression of urban identity. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pat Berger. I'm an emeritus professor of Chinese art from the Department of History of Art at UC Berkeley. And on behalf of my colleagues in the department, first of all, I'd like to thank the Getty for organizing this wonderful event, which should become a classic event for graduate students in years to come. It's really, really valuable, and as has been shown by the first session and the first paper in this session, I'm extremely delighted to introduce my own student, Patricia J, who's a PhD candidate at Berkeley, and I should tell you she's also a native of Los Angeles, which is a great claim to fame, I think. Patricia's interests span Chinese garden design and its adaptation in the West in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and also the much broader issues of the global exchange of objects. She was a Getty predoctoral fellow last year, and she's just completed a Mellon curatorial internship in the Department of Asian Export Art at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. Patricia's research focuses on the many modern and contemporary reincarnations of a garden, the Yuanming Yuan, which was the imperial garden of perfect brightness, or we might translate the all-encompassing gardens of luminosity. It was a massive and complex landscape constructed outside the Qing Dynasty capital at Beijing in the 18th century. The garden was looted and all but destroyed by Western Allied troops during the Second Opium War. And as Patricia will show, its memory, despite its intense fragmentation, is both indelible and controversial. It's fueled debates about spectacular display in Asian and European courts since the 18th century, but more recently, it's been a lens through which Chinese nationhood has been framed and reconstituted. So please join me in welcoming Patricia Yu.
Thank you, Pat, for that very beautiful introduction that encapsulates my project so well. I'll try to live up to that description. And thank you to the Getty as well for having me back. I was a little worried that you were already tired of seeing my face around since I was here last year. But let me begin. In 2006, the founder of the Hendian Group announced its plans to construct a full-scale replica of the Yuanmingyuan, this 18th century Qing Dynasty imperial garden, as the latest addition to their complex of theme parks known as Hendian World Studios. Located about 2 hours outside of Shanghai, the city of Hendian is known as being the Hollywood of the East. The parks are full-scale replicas of places like the First Emperor's Palace, the Forbidden City, 19th century streetscapes, Buddhist temples, and so on. So if you've seen the movies Hero or Curse of the Golden Flower, you've seen these film sites and theme parks in action. So these sites primarily attract domestic tourists who come from all over China. When the project was announced, it quickly became embroiled in a debate about the appropriateness of reproducing and reconstructing the Yuanmingyuan in its entirety at 1-to-1 scale. You might ask, what's one more replica in a city of replicas? And I would say that it's precisely because the Yuanmingyuan has stood as ruins for the last century and a half, having been looted and burned by the English and French troops led by Lord Elgin during the Second Opium War in 1860. And this Lord Elgin is the son of the other Elgin who took the Parthenon marbles, so a grand British tradition. In the writing of modern Chinese history, the ruins of the Yuanmingyuan stand as witnesses to China's century of humiliation. The possibility of reconstruction hovers over the site, offering the allure that the restoration of the garden would indicate the restoration of China as a nation from the humiliation of the preceding century. After all, Zhou Enlai did say in 1949 on the birth of the People's Republic, quote, "The Yuanmingyuan ruins must be protected. Its lands cannot be given away. When circumstances allow, we can restore it," end quote. In the post-Mao era, as China arose as an economic and political superpower, the question of the Yuanmingyuan ruins provoked debate in the public sphere about whether or not to rebuild it. My larger project takes fragmentation as a point of departure and examines the multiple ways in which the fragments of the Yuanmingyuan have been reconstituted and reproduced. In this paper, I look specifically at the reproduction of the Yuanmingyuan at miniature and monumental scale within the context of theme park landscapes. By reconstructing off-site, the theme parks are a translation. They are spatial translations in that they have shifted away from the original site to a different location, as well as reinterpreting the form for a new audience and a new landscape context. I borrowed the term modelscape from the work of Yael Padan, who applies that term to her studies of miniature and monumental models of Israel, which, quote, represent collective pasts, as well as visions of the future, end quote. I argue that the Yuanmingyuan's microcosmic nature makes it the ideal modelscape that attempts to replicate the past for the purpose of projecting it into the future. The original Yuanmingyuan is located in the northwest suburbs of Beijing and was established in 1709 as a retreat for the Yongzhen Emperor and was expanded throughout the 18th century. By the eve of its destruction by the English and the French, it encompassed 3 gardens as one. So usually in Chinese, we call it the Yuanming Sanyuan, so the Yuanming 3 gardens. As you can see here, we have the Yuanmingyuan proper, and then the addition of the Garden of Eternal Spring and the addition of the Elegant Spring Garden together, that we sort of refer to collectively now as the Yuanmingyuan. Scholars have characterized the Yuanmingyuan as a microcosm of the Qing Empire in form and in ideology. Laid out as a series of gardens within gardens, the Yuanmingyuan includes administrative zones, imperial residences, scenes of rusticity, commerce, and fantasy, as well as scenes that recall famous garden sites through which the emperor had toured when he went into southern China. Most famously, the northeast corner incorporates Sino-Baroque European palaces and fountains designed by the Jesuits who were working in the Qing court. And when you go to the Yuanmingyuan Ruins Park today, it's the ruins of these European palaces that you're probably going to see first. And in some ways, the form of these ruins have taken over the general perception of what the site of the Yuanmingyuan was like. So that often, if you're just talking to someone on the street and say that you're working on the Yuanmingyuan, they say, oh, the European garden. And then you have to explain, well, actually, the European palaces was only a small sliver of the garden, but the only part of it that's really left that you can see are the ruins of these buildings. So because the Yuanmingyuan itself has these kind of thematic zones, that has led scholars of Chinese theme parks to identify the Yuanmingyuan as the progenitor of theme parks in China. So it's perhaps profoundly appropriate that the garden itself remanifests as a theme park. The Splendid China miniature theme park opened in 1989 in the special economic zone of Shenzhen, located on the tip of the Chinese mainland, right across from Hong Kong. It modeled the nature in miniature, replicating famous sites at 1 to 15 scale, such as the Forbidden City, gardens of Suzhou, Buddhist cave temples, the Tibetan Potala Palace. And if you look at the map that the theme park itself produces, you can see that they've actually adjusted the geography of the site a little bit to further reinforce the idea that it is the nation in miniature. In 1994, it expanded to include an area for a miniature Yuanmingyuan, and in both square footage and scale, this section is the largest in the park. As you approach, you don't immediately see the miniatures. The path takes you away from the previous scenes of China and leads you to the iconic broken pillars and ruined archway, replicated at close to full scale. The replicated ruins mark the time as the present. This is what the Yuanmingyuan has been reduced to now. And this is reinforced by an audio track that you can hear that tells you about how it was destroyed by Western imperialists, which then brings the tragic past into the space of the present. You take a few steps further, and then we step into the nostalgic time of the past, where scenes from the Yuanmingyuan are laid before us in 1 to 8 scale, at nearly twice the size of the other miniatures within the park. Unlike analogous Qing imperial sites that are replicated in the park, like the Forbidden City or the New Summer Palace, the Yuanmingyuan section here actually accommodates visitor movement through the scene, so you can actually kind of walk through the Yuanmingyuan, and then each scene has a little label that identifies it by name. But when we compare the layout of the original with the layout of the theme park, we see that the miniature theme park has selectively replicated the Yuanmingyuan. It's chosen only certain key scenes. The imperial microcosm has been spatially condensed. In Splendid China, we have a nested series of microcosms. We have a miniaturized imperial microcosm located within a microcosm of the Chinese nation, itself located in Shenzhen, a city serving as an experimental model economic zone. In Splendid China, the Yuanmingyuan was just one scene among many. In 1997, the year of Hong Kong's return to China, Shenzhen's neighboring city, Zhuhai, opened the new Yuanming Palace, which reconstructed the Yuanmingyuan at 1-to-1 scale on 148 acres. I don't think it's a coincidence that the return of Hong Kong, which was ceded to the British at the end of the First Opium War, was celebrated with the reconstruction of an imperial garden that was burned down during the Second. Although individual structures were built at full scale, the Zhuhai Park was similar to Splendid China in the sense that it also selectively replicated scenes and rearranged them according to the topography at Zhuhai, not according to the garden's original spatial layout. In the spatial arrangement of both parks, the spatial integrity of the Yuanmingyuan is sundered, and its scenes have been reduced to rearrangeable sets of modular motifs. Since the primary visual referent for the Yuanmingyuan is the painting album of its 40 scenes and the set of prints of the European palaces, I'd like to tentatively propose that the fragmented viewing experience of the album and the prints encourages the further separation of each scene as a movable module. What's really interesting to me about the Zhuhai theme park is that when you go there now, 20 years after it first opened, it's actually no longer really functioning as a theme park. It does not, you don't have to pay admission to go in. There are multiple points of entry, so its boundaries are now quite porous between itself and the city in which it resides. The buildings are slowly being converted into shops, tea houses, restaurants, so that this replication of the Hall of Calm Seas is actually now, when you enter on the other side, a seafood restaurant. And so it's transitioning into another type of themed urban space. It's both an urban greenscape, but also turning into a shopping and entertainment space. So we can see in these two examples that the partial and rearranged reconstruction at one-to-one scale didn't provoke any controversy that these theme parks would threaten the memory and impression of the original site. But 10 years later, in 2006, when the Hendian group proposed to reconstruct the Yuanmingyuan in its entirety at full scale, that sparked a debate about the replication of form and the memory of a cultural heritage site. Would the reconstruction erase the memory of humiliation and ruination? Would the Chinese people forget the past that had occurred? Would the reconstruction be just a tacky fake antique? How did the Hendian group reassure its critics that they were not going to build a fake antique that would threaten the memory of the original? By showcasing a miniature model. This model is located in one of their other theme park complexes, the Folk Residence Exhibition Museum, established in 2008. Like the other Hendian parks, the Folk Residence Museum is simultaneously a film set and tourist site, but it differs in one key aspect. Instead of building copies of Mingqing vernacular architecture, this park has moved actual vernacular residences from the Mingqing and Republic eras on site, laying claim to architectural authenticity, as well as laying claim to cultural heritage preservation. So it's within this setting of architectural authenticity that the model for the new Yuanmingyuan resides. And this model is enormous. It measures 50 by 40 meters, occupies more than 2,000 square meters, and is built at 1:50 scale. And although the model is technically a miniature, I would argue that it operates on the principles of monumentality, a monumental miniature. Unlike the miniature as theorized by Susan Stewart, this model cannot be encompassed by the body. It can't be held between your clasped hands as a cherished object to be close to yourself. The model astounds you with its size. Its entirety cannot be seen at ground level. The eye must be elevated to the second-story balcony to be able to encompass it in its entirety. But then in that case, the body is kept at a distance, pushed to the model's perimeter. We can pay homage to it through circumambulation, but we're not allowed to penetrate into the interior. And even when seen from above, your eye strains to locate the most familiar individual structures. Pedagogically, the model communicates the spatial layout of the Yuanmingyuan, the relationship between waterways, land, and building complexes. We get a general sense of the density of the site, the variety of building types within it. We realize that the European palaces comprise such a slender strip of the garden that we can barely see it. We're to be shocked, awed, and impressed. Look at what a great accomplishment the Yuanmingyuan was during the height of its glory. Look at its size and its complexity. Even when it's shrunken down, it still takes up the entire hall. Isn't it a shame that the real one is reduced to empty fields and broken pieces of stone? The model reassures in its presentation of wholeness and attention to detail. It assuages the worry of critics who fear that there's not enough information to rebuild the site, nor the technical skill to do it. The model shows each structure, each tree, each street lamp meticulously rendered and placed. Here, the street lamps, themselves themed with Chinese roofs, support the model's argument that it's simultaneously presenting something that was the original, as well as something that will be the park that is to be built. Look, it says, besides the addition of unobtrusive street lamps to guide the way of visitors, no real changes have been made. We've built the model, so we've proved that we do know what it looks like, down to the very last column. So, what happens if you actually visit the site itself of the built parks, which opened in 2016? I think the critics who were concerned that the Hendian project to reconstruct it in its entirety can now rest assured that the theme park reconstruction will probably not create slippage between the theme park and the original historic site. A site visit to the newly opened tourist attraction reveals a disjuncture between the model as promised and the site as built. Rather than one park that encompasses a continuous swath of space, the Hendian New Yuanming Palace is actually split into 4 separate, non-adjacent ticketed parks. On the one hand, you could say that this reflects the Yuanyuan's own division of 3 gardens in 1. However, the original's tripartite division still occupies adjacent spaces next to each other with movement between them possible. From my own experience of the sites, as well as from the maps shown here, we see that the layout of the individual parks also does not at all correspond to the layout of the originals. Similar to the rearrangement of scenes in the Zhuhai Park, the Hendian parks have also completely rearranged the placement of scenes in relation to topography and their relation to each other, as if every scene existed separately and could be endlessly shuffled into new configurations. Intriguingly, the Hendian park's claim to wholeness goes beyond the replication of each scene at monumental scale. The Yuanmingyuan itself included the construction of buildings in a Sino-Western style, those European palaces in that northeast strip of the garden. In Hendian, that park, the theme park, also includes these structures, basing them off of the prints. The park, however, does not stop there. The Yuanmingyuan's own inclusion of a themed section of European palaces left open the door for the Hendian Park to expand upon that very theme and include structures that were never part of the original. Yes, that was my reaction as well. Along the theme park's own northeast corner, so to the back of the park if you were to visit, we find some strangely familiar structures. A Russian church, a German triumphal arch, a French palace of the arts, an American manor, an Austrian palace of art, an Italian aristocratic manor, and an English aristocratic manor, and a Japanese temple. And those names that I just gave are exactly how they are labeled within the park itself. So they are presented as representative types. They don't tell you what the original referent was. The reconstruction of the Yuanmingyuan here as a whole and complete site, not in ruins, in other words, creates a valorizing narrative in which the destruction of the Opium Wars never took place. I find it curious that the additional foreign buildings, of which there are exactly 8, correspond exactly to the 8 nations that participated in the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. Now, the Boxer Rebellion is a separate event from the Second Opium War and the burning of the Yuanmingyuan in 1860, but in the Chinese popular imagination, the 2 events often get conflated. So that if you're just talking to regular people, they'll often say, oh, it was this, during the Boxer Rebellion that the 8 armies destroyed the Yuanmingyuan. So in addition to constructing a Yuanmingyuan that never burned down, the Hendian Park also presents a vision of an ever-expanding Yuanmingyuan, one that continues to enfold the rest of the world into its walls. The condensation of monumental replicas of international architectural representatives within the single space of the Hendian Park recalls the precedent to modern theme parks, the World's Fair. And here we come to our very last Yuanmingyuan model, a monumental miniature that was first displayed at the Shanghai World Expo of 2010. Sculpted out of precious woods and precious stones, this 18 by 14 square meter model at 1:150 scale was a labor of love for a wood carving artist, Mr. Kan Sanxi, an artist from Shanghai who has been granted the title of Intangible Cultural Heritage Practitioner for his achievements in traditional wood carving. Why display a model of the Yuanmingyuan at this particular site at the World's Fair? The model is displayed at an expo whose theme was Better City, Better Life, inside the World Trade Center Association Pavilion, whose own sub-theme focused on green living and peace and stability through trade. As a modelscape, this Yuanmingyuan miniature offers a pivot between the preserving of the past and the advancement of the future. It offers the hope that the city of the future preserves cultural heritage, both as physical sites and as intangible practices. It suggests that the spatial model of the Chinese garden offers an alternative mode of urban planning. And finally, that as a model of a Qing imperial garden that was itself constructed during an age of globalism when all the world sought to trade with China, it legitimizes the pavilion's theme of a future dependent upon global interconnections. This model is now displayed in the lobby of the Museum of Chinese Garden and Landscape Architecture, located in the Garden Expo Park in the Fengtai district of Beijing. The museum itself operates under the theme of Chinese gardens, ideal homes, and it has created within itself typological Chinese gardens as sort of pedagogical model rooms within it to demonstrate regional differences in garden design. The model of the Yuanmingyuan, this garden of gardens, anchors the entrance of this museum that is about gardens. Behind it, a garden rock from the actual Yuanmingyuan itself anchors the model. The relic legitimizes the model, and the model gives form to the fragmented relic. Thank you.
My name is Richard Wittman. I'm a professor at UC Santa Barbara. I'd like to thank the Getty for hosting this event, and I'm here to introduce our next speaker. Laura diZerega is a PhD candidate in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at UC Santa Barbara, specializing in the history of architecture with a focus on European 18th and 19th century, particularly the German-speaking parts of it. Laura's dissertation project is entitled Secularizing, or at least it was entitled the last time we spoke, but like every dissertation, as this joke has already been made today, it changes sometimes, but currently, Secularizing the Sacred, Carl Friedrich Schinkel and Rhenish Ecclesiastical Architecture, 1815 to 40. A study that examines Schinkel's administration of ecclesiastical architecture in the Prussian Rhineland, a territory that Prussia gained after the fall of Napoleon in 1815. And it's a project that investigates state bureaucracy as a fundamentally new dimension of the modern relationship between architecture and its publics. Bureaucracy not just as a top-down mechanism of acculturation, but as a surprisingly permeable site of contestation and resistance. Laura returned just about a year ago from her long research stay in Berlin, where she was a doctoral research fellow in the Berlin program for advanced German and European studies at the Freie Universität in Berlin. During the period of her graduate research, Laura has given papers at an array of international conferences in Scotland, Switzerland, Germany, in German as well, which is amazing to me, and has worked on a variety of exhibitions and conferences in the USA in various capacities. Laura is currently working to bring her dissertation in for a landing, but at the same time, she holds a J. Paul Getty Foundation graduate internship here at the Publications Division. So please join me in welcoming Laura diZerega.
Thank you, Richard. And thanks, of course, to Rebecca and Chelsea for organizing this, and thank you all for coming out to support us today. It's great to get feedback, and I know we're all grateful for this opportunity. Okay. make sure I get my pointer set in the right direction. So, architectural culture in 19th century Europe might be broadly described as a series of attempts to answer the question, in which style shall we build? As architects and stakeholders looked back to history, choosing architectural styles from periods past to address the cultural conditions of their present. In the early 19th century, we find treatises debating the proper architectural style specifically for churches. Such debates were prompted by catastrophes, such as the 1823 fire that destroyed the Church of St. Paul outside the walls, one of Rome's 4 major basilicas, or the 1809 fire that badly damaged one of Berlin's oldest churches, the Petrikirche. While such isolated calamities, like the slightly later debates concerning the completion of Cologne Cathedral, provided the most spectacular occasions for discussions concerning the style of ecclesiastical architecture best suited for a modern age, these debates also unfolded in significant measure against a backdrop of considerable church building and repair activity in provincial towns and villages, where the ecclesiastical infrastructure had been decimated by the Napoleonic Wars. There we go. Prussian state architect Carl Friedrich Schinkel figured prominently in these debates. In 1827, he designed a template for village churches that was distributed for use throughout Prussia's provinces. Treatises on the optimal style for churches written by Schinkel's contemporaries also featured designs for modest provincial structures. The archives of the Prussian building bureaucracy indicate so many provincial demands for government support of ecclesiastical building initiatives in the 1820s and 30s that Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm III pleaded with his bureaucrats to place limits on the state funding for such projects. Yet, the stakes of this work were high for the Prussian monarchy. The king and his ministers viewed the cultivation of popular piety in the provinces as a safeguard against civil unrest, and for that reason, they were loath to ignore provincial funding pleas completely. After all, a well-built, state-funded parish church could do much to convey the authority and the piety of the Prussian regime in its distant provinces. But then in 1835, at the heart of the architectural style debates, Schinkel repudiated the 1827 design. You see here in ground plan, elevation, cross-section, as well as detail of interior and exterior ornament. In its place, Schinkel put forward a memorandum consisting of 20 dense pages of text with 13 rudimentary schematics. What explained this change of heart? How did Schinkel's developing thought on provincial church fit into wider contemporary debate? To answer these questions, this paper will begin with a look at Schinkel's 1827 church design template, together with 2 other contemporary treatises equally concerned to define the optimal architectural style for the village church. The second half of my talk will then shift to Schinkel's unpublished 1835 memorandum. My argument here will be that the 1835 text offered a bold new conception of public architecture's role as a tool for the modern state, one that envisioned state-sponsored provincial church building as a contract of sorts between state and citizen for their mutual benefit. Our story starts with the 1826 visit by King Friedrich Wilhelm III to the small Protestant church in the village of Nackel. Schinkel had designed it back in 1819. The church's economical and decorous design pleased the monarch, and so he instructed Schinkel to copy the 1819 plans and send them to every provincial government for use as the design template for all Prussian churches receiving state funds. The detailed engravings Schinkel prepared depict a modest single-aisle church scattered with an amalgam of classicizing decorative motifs Schinkel would have known from published collections of plates such as Stuart and Rivette's The Antiquities of Athens. The church's rectangular ground plan, seen here in cross-section, featured a barrel-vaulted coffered ceiling. Seating galleries supported by rows of fluted columns extended over the nave, and 3 round arched windows on either side illuminated the interior. The engravings gave classical elements for decoration of the altar, including a series of palmette-shaped acroteria along the top of the pulpit sounding board, up here, a stylized floral base for the pulpit, and stucco ornament on the exterior that evoked carving of ancient Roman sarcophagi. Schinkel explained it was necessary to program the church's decoration in such fine detail because, quote, the ignorance on these matters in the provinces is still quite large, end quote. Schinkel insisted on the more time-consuming and expensive technique of engraving over lithography to achieve the highest quality reproductions of his plans, and he distributed his finished products to Prussia's 10 regional government offices with clear instructions they be used for any churches supported by state funds. Yet no sooner did his plans land on provincial desks than letters began arriving back to complain about the shortcomings of his design. Many of the complaints centered on the lack of a tower, the central architectural feature of so many rural townscapes. They also served practical functions such as timekeeping and observation over the surrounding area. Schinkel, with the monarch's permission, promptly distributed a variant with 2 different sized towers for regional governments, an example of the give and take brought on between the province and central government over state-sponsored architecture. Schinkel's reliance at Knockel on motifs from ancient Greece and Rome, as well as from early Christian models, is similar to the approach taken by his contemporaries Louis Catel and Leo von Klenze in their efforts at provincial church design. In 1815, the Berlin architect Catel published his treatise entitled Fundamentals of a Theory on the Building Style of Protestant Churches. Spurred on by discussions surrounding the burned-out Petrikirche, Catel devoted a chapter to its rebuilding. But Catel's concern to reform church style went beyond the Petrikirche. He stood firm in his conviction that contemporary church design was obligated to reach beyond the spiritual and express the conditions of modern life. Catel surveyed the prevailing styles employed in religious architecture, namely Gothic, ancient Greek, and ancient Roman, before dismissing the Gothic outright as an historical phenomenon not suited to Protestantism's liturgical emphasis on the word. Catel offered 3 templates for Protestant churches. They ranged in size from a church designed to hold nearly 4,000 congregants to a village church for 800, all drawing on the vocabulary of classical architecture. Catel insisted that a combination of Greco-Roman architectural elements would best meet the great challenge of his age, namely what he described as the development of the citizenry's political and civic acumen. His village church design again featured a barrel-vaulted nave with rows of Greek Doric columns supporting a straight entablature below upper-level seating galleries. Catel insisted there was, quote, no place for extravagant building projects or colossal old German cathedrals, end quote. And he concluded that ecclesiastical architecture, incorporating the Roman arch, would allow his age to synthesize what he called Greek rationality with Gothic spirit, thereby elevating the public to a higher plane of civic development. For Catel, ecclesiastical architecture thus served both religious and civic function. Outside of Prussia, Bavarian court architect Leo von Klenze published a book entitled Instructions for the Architecture of the Christian Religion in 1822. And like Catel, Klenze did not view the Gothic as a suitable choice for contemporary church design. Unlike Catel, Klenze's designs for village churches were meant for use in both Catholic and Protestant worship. He gave 3 variants on the small church, including a range of ancient included a range of ancient Greco-Roman architectural motifs. Left to right, an entry framed by Doric columns and a pediment, a facade in the design of a triumphal arch in the center, and a facade featuring a cornice studded with triglyphs over 4 Doric columns supporting arches and flanked by a colossal order of Doric pilasters. Klenze described his design as hovering between, quote, the border of classicism, which retains the architectural beauty and effect, and the border of embellishment, and we have taken care not to overstep this most dangerous border, end quote. Clearly, Clenza took very seriously the representative power of the modest provincial church. In their templates, Schinkel, Cattell, and Clenza thus searched for architectural language that balanced rationality, decorum, piety, and ornament, while searching to express the conditions of modern life. Their concerns to reform church style included the design of modest churches outside urban centers, and the use of the Roman arch rooted their projects within the classical tradition, but in a more technologically advanced phase of it than represented by the trabeated post and lintel system of the Greeks. At the same time, tying the arch to the first monumental churches of early Christian Rome, they bound their designs to Christian tradition. And as a once pagan style, the architectural motifs of ancient Rome provided these 19th century German architects with a powerful example of a style that had evolved in response to the needs of its day, namely the new Christian religion, just as the style might continue to adapt to the new conditions of their present 19th century day. But in July 1834, upon visiting a church recently completed according to his own 1827 template, Schinkel judged the character of the building as too pretentious for such a small structure, and what is more, he found the exterior plasterwork was poorly executed, a major problem for a design that relied heavily on the use of ornamental stucco. In a written letter to his superiors, he concluded that the 1827 design was no longer suitable for general use. It was common for Schinkel to voice frustration with the executions of his designs. In reports written on long tours of Prussia's provinces during the summers of 1832, 33, and 34, he often complained about provincial architects failing to follow his plans. He described buildings in which the overall proportions were incorrect, towers that did not accord with the size of the church, in which the common practice of whitewashing interiors with plaster obscured architectural detail. He characterized one structure as, quote unquote, unrecognizable when compared with his plan. And such frustrations were magnified by the vital function that he placed upon architecture, particularly in the provinces, as a tool that would guide Prussia's continued evolution as a cultivated modern society. Commenting on the shortcomings of provincial architecture, Schinkel stressed that every major community architectural undertaking was both an object of public interest and an object of honor to the state. Accordingly, such projects should express the state's highest level of cultivation for the benefit of visitors from other countries, for posterity, and to promote the erudition of the citizenry. Yet even as Schinkel spoke of ennobling the nation through provincial architecture, he observed that the ecclesiastical architecture of his own day, quote, stood in striking contrast to magnificent, splendid churches left over from an earlier age, better organized for church building, end quote. Schinkel's new approach to design of village churches in 1835, therefore, must be viewed in the context of the civic importance with which Schinkel invested provincial architecture and the frustrations he encountered in practice. Comparing the discursive approach of his 1835 plan to the earlier stylistic didacticism of Cattell, Clenza, and Schinkel himself, one of the first things we notice is the relative lack of images. In his 1835 memorandum, Schinkel included just 3 sets of schematics nestled among the text. Figures A through E on the left gave the 5 common ground plans for use in village churches. F through G in the middle presented the acceptable ratios of height to width based on the ground plans. And H through M illustrated the correct proportions for supporting wall height relative to roof height. In contrast to his 1827 plan, Schinkel's guidelines provided no detail on either style or ornament. They focused solely on those proportions he viewed as necessary for the optimal enclosure of space. His initial draft in the memorandum was even more sparsely illustrated. The ground plans in figures A through E and the ratios in F and G were an afterthought, included in the second draft only after Schinkel note in a margin, quote, "Shall we add something general about the ground plans and their layout?" End quote. His 1835 memorandum did not illustrate a church's optimal interior configuration either. It simply emphasized the need for unobstructed views of the pulpit and altar and careful attention to acoustics and illumination. Departing from the contemporary practice of using architectural drawings to argue that a specific stylistic language, such as Gothic or Ancient Greek, best articulated a national spirit or essence, Schinkel's minimal approach pared down style to the absolutely essential proportional relationships. This lack of images reveals a conception of the provincial church that is oriented less toward formalist aesthetics and more towards an idealized fulfillment of functional requirements. Instead of contemporary concerns such as round versus pointed arches, Doric or Corinthian, Schinkel sought a rhetoric of clarity, harmony, and rationality that might translate ennobling civic ideals into sacred space. Provincial churches, in Schinkel's estimation, were thus model worlds, correctly proportioned, community-based totems of modern, pious Prussia. Schinkel's text of 1835 went on, in fact, to make a forceful argument against the use of stylistic templates for church building. He believed that templates offered few advantages, and he felt that every building's unique spatial needs, location and function, as well as available funds and building materials, limited the utility of templates. And the practicality, he said, virtually disappeared when one factored in prevailing customs and religious practices surrounding provincial projects, not to mention the demands of aesthetics. But Schinkel felt the gravest danger of templates was that they stifled local participation in the building process. Few architects, he wrote, carry out the directives of a stranger with the same passion they apply to the execution of their own designs. Schinkel argued that the architect's emotional and intellectual investment in a project often represented, quote, the only guarantee, end quote, of good results. And such an investment could be blunted by the adherence to templates, leading to what Schinkel called a poverty of ideas. Template designs mandated by the authorities would stymie architecture's civic calling to elevate the provinces and with them, the nation. Schinkel argued that the best advice one could give to provincial church builders was to observe the clarity and solid technique of older churches in their own districts, use these as appropriate with the better technology available in their day. For Schinkel in 1835, therefore, style was not a product to be added in, but a process to be fostered. Not mandated beforehand, it would emerge when the cultivating power of timeless architectural principles was actualized through local participation, tradition, and knowledge. Public architecture thus acted as a contract entered into by the state and its citizens, providing a model for civic participation that united the universal with the local, and which ideally would result in churches that harmonized national and local civic identity. In summary, in an age that yearned to identify an optimal national style, Schinkel's Village Church Memo of 1835 is significant for its novel consideration of architecture as a societal process rather than a formal stylistic act. For Schinkel, better buildings, respectful of local practices and involving local publics, might ultimately forge better citizens. It is worth noting that Schinkel had not always seen things this way. He reached this point only after 2 decades of continued engagement with provincial ecclesiastical architecture and with the designers, builders, and the citizenry who used it. From his early reviews of provincial church plans in 1810 to lengthy provincial tours of the mid-1830s, Schinkel was perpetually in negotiation with provincial architects and communities. They regularly resisted the policy prescriptions he tried to dictate from Berlin, and in this way, the Prussian bureaucratic initiatives carried out by Schinkel paradoxically opened up new discursive spaces for debate. Those resistant and heretofore understudied provincials surely deserve a measure of credit for bending Schinkel's thought in the new and daring directions revealed by the 1835 memorandum. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambra, Patricia, and Laura, for 3 really fascinating studies. I'd like to welcome you back to the stage now and reintroduce Richard Wittman, who is our moderator for the discussion session. Richard is Associate Professor in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he has taught since 2004. His first book was Architecture, Print Culture, and the Public Sphere in 18th Century France, published first in 2007 and coming out later this year in French translation. He is currently finishing his second book, A Cultural History of the 106-Year Reconstruction of the Early Christian Basilica of San Paolo Fiore di Mura in Rome between 1825 and 1931. Welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm just going to say a minimal sort of intervention at the beginning and then hopefully turn it over to questions for our three excellent panelists. I couldn't help, though, but be struck by the fact that the Q&A for the last panel kind of, in a way, centered around a discussion of the concept of the arbitrary finality of the work of art. And I think the architectural historians in the audience may perhaps have been thinking that that's not often a big problem for us. And I think this panel was really illustrative of that, a reminder that the architectural history aspect of the art history discipline, I guess, is always, but even increasingly, I'd say, not about finality or about the artistic intention as an end in itself or the processes that make the art object, but increasingly there's a sort of focus on the social and cultural world in which the object lives and is appropriated and used and changed and remembered. And so for that, I think it was an interesting kind of other shoe to drop in our thinking about how the art history discipline is changing right now. I'm not smart enough to come up with a question that's equally relevant to all three papers. So maybe what I'll do is say a few words to each panelist and leave you each with a question, which means Ambra will have the longest time to think about the question before you answer, and we'll go around this way. But I was really interested and convinced by your presentation, Ambra, the idea that there's a kind of fundamental problem in trying to read the functions of these spaces based on the iconography of the images. And I really liked also the way in which what this led you to was a wider social focus in trying to estimate the audience and the understanding of this very different society of the spectacle that you were talking about. And my question is kind of a pedestrian one in a way, but are there any written sources for the use? Well, no, for the use of these rooms in particular, because I would guess that for almost any subsequent age, and of course that's the key word, subsequent, I could think of where one would go to look for those kinds of texts, manuals of etiquette or how to run a household and things like this. But I mean, maybe the answer to this question is no, there are none. But if you can think about some response to that. And yeah. Patricia, I loved your paper, which really resonates with a lot of things. I mean, I'm writing a book about a reconstruction of a building that was burned, and for the paranoid Catholics in Rome in the 1820s, it's as good as if it was burned by an enemy army. It was burned by the army of philosophy and secularism, according to them. So your paper just pressed all of my buttons. And also at another level, and this is kind of the area where my question, and it's more like I would like you to maybe comment on this theme, which is that, there is something about architectural space that is irreducible, right? You have to go to it. It is the real space of our bodies and in which sort of real time elapses. But we live in this mobile information age where we are spoiled, in a sense, for choice. We are able to be, at least virtually or informationally, anywhere, both historically and geographically through technologies. And I suppose what I found interesting about the various sites that you showed wasn't so much, I mean, it is obviously the rebuilding and this question of whether you can rebuild it, how you should rebuild it, what it means to rebuild it, but actually just the sheer multiplication of this site, and the fact that this site becomes, it doesn't become omnipresent in the way a printed text becomes omnipresent or a digital image becomes omnipresent, but within the actual phenomenal world of real space, it's moving in that direction. And I'm just wondering if you would maybe say a few words about that. And then Laura, it's always difficult to ask a question of someone whose work you know quite intimately, but great paper. I found it very convincing.
That's a lot, say, from your advisor.
Exactly. But no, the question that occurred to me hearing it was how, obviously Schinkel's career unfolds against this backdrop of it's an era of incipient mass politics. I mean, it's not as mass as the late 19th century or certainly as the early 20th century and so on, but it is the beginnings of that. And the first half of the 19th century, as you know, is defined by a lot of kind of instrumental acknowledgments of the public. I mean, one in particular that has been written about lately are pantheons, where instead of kings and saints being the subject of monuments, generals, admirals, soldiers, people like that, and this has been interpreted as a sign of a growing awareness on the parts of the elites that there's a kind of broader society of individuals that have a role and a function and increasingly a voice in society and also deserve in a way to be memorialized. And so I guess what I was thinking is Schinkel, I don't think, is instrumentalizing the public the publics who he's had to interact with, but I was wondering whether you think there's any connection in what Schinkel is doing with the idea of Bildung, which, of course, has been theorized by people Schinkel knew personally in the first half of the 19th century in Berlin. And to talk about this concept of Bildung, how perhaps for Schinkel, perhaps not, it was sort of pried open, and Schinkel was sort of, in a way, forced to accept a kind of broadened social understanding and a less elite understanding of that concept, and just talk a little bit about whether you think that that's part of what's going on here. All right.
I start.
Ambra goes first.
Does it work? Yes. So, very interesting question. The short answer before I start, as an Italian to speak for half an hour, hopefully not. Yes and no. Yes. Yes and no, because for the tablinum, there are very, very few ancient sources mentioned in this space, which is bad and good. Good because there is so far you can deal with. Bad because none of these sources also match with what they say, and they are not telling an exact use of this space as at the time they were writing. So the puzzling, for instance, the etymology of this space tablinum is still puzzling. For instance, Varro mentioned the tablinum as the space referred as the tabule, like the wooden board, meant to build this space in the house, where the people of the old time used the imperfect form, so not contemporary to his use. So people of the old time basically used to eat in the summertime. Then we have Pliny and Festus, later in the 1st and 2nd century CE, who mention actually this space tablinum, from the tabule as archival material. That were maintained and preserved and as a repository into this space. They too do use the imperfect form. So they too do not talk about a contemporary use of this room at the time of the 1st and 2nd century. So I think they too didn't have a real idea of what this space took its name, like compared to the cubiculum, which comes from cubare, to sleep. Although the cubiculum could have been used for different, kind of functions. So there is a big problem with the literary sources because none of them exactly tell you the use of this space.
And plays don't depict, for example,
plays, no.
It being used.
No, and the other problem is also this idea of the salutatio actually is derived from Vitruvius, who describes the Roman house and the spaces and the form of the rooms inside the house. And he mentions how people of a certain income should not have magnificent vestibula, atria, or tablina, because they used to go to the others' houses rather than have the others, at home. It doesn't say anything about the salutatio, so we cannot know which period of the time. And it focuses on the appearance of this room, not on the presence of this room. So that's what, the big problem with later scholarship in, connecting the salutatio with this room. But in my personal work, I try to use all the various, not only literary, but also archaeological evidence, which is something that mostly in archaeology people don't do. They focus on paintings or material culture or on literature and try to see all of them together because they're all biased, taken by themselves. But if you have all of them together, you can try to actually understand the uses of this space. This is a space that was versatile, like the Roman house. Every room could have been used for different things at different time of the day, different season. So it's a space where you could have perhaps have a dinner party with guests. It's big enough to have that. Often it has a central emblema, mosaic, that could have fitted around triclinia couches. There are examples of tablina that actually have cut recesses for triclinia beds. In my study of 172 tablina, none of them has records of archival material found in any of them. And indeed, usually archival materials, which of course you will say it's hard that they were preserved, clear. But they're always being found in cubicula on the upper floor, never on tablina. So in rooms that are also smaller and probably easier to preserve material that is important to the family. So definitely if that was the use in the older time, this is not the current use at the time of the 79 CE, for sure.
So again, no finality.
No, exactly. You need to use all the sources and still you have a big question mark, I guess.
Fantastic. Okay.
Well, you started out your question with the idea that we are now living in the digital age. And actually, one of the reconstructions of the Yuanmingyuan that I'm looking at, that I hope will be in the epilogue of the dissertation, is in fact a digital reconstruction that the Tsinghua Heritage Institute for Digitization is currently working on. You can download it as an app on your iPad. And what it does, what the digital allows them to do is that it can then play with the idea of arbitrary finality, because now that you are not reconstructing as a physical site, you are not committed to choosing an arbitrary point in the timeline to which to reconstruct. So with the digital, it allows us to expand. You can actually see the site change over time as it expanded throughout the 18th and 19th century. What the digital reconstruction has also been doing is that it's been trying to find out what the interiors of some of these spaces look like. And that actually gets to your question about multiples, that the Yuanmingyuan theme parks exist as a set of multiples. And now you've opened the box to the question of multiplicity within the Qing dynasty and their way of thinking about and producing art and spaces. And that some of the few interior spaces of the Yuanmingyuan that we have an idea of what they may have looked like is because in the archival sources, we can see line items in the imperial workshops that says, so-and-so artist, paint a wall mural like the one you did at this other site. And so if we have the other site, then it's almost as if they have, that the Qing emperors themselves have created their own backups. That allow for us now to restore it. And the Yuanmingyuan, in some ways, is not terribly unique in the Qing imperial landscape because they're quite an itinerant ruling house where they're constantly traveling throughout their empire. So up in Chengde, 3 hours outside of Beijing on the other side up in the mountains, you have another imperial microcosm that also replicates imperial residences, southern Suzhou gardens, Tibetan temples. So the empire itself is always multiplying and creating spaces within itself. So I suppose it's in some ways entirely appropriate that if you're going to bring the Yuanmingyuan back to life, that it has all these multiple lives around modern China.
There's a joke about the cloud to be made in there, but I can't quite put it together. But I do think if you publish these papers, I think we have the title of the arbitrary finality. I think that's good. You haven't copyrighted that, I hope. Or, no, okay. Yeah, exactly. It's quite good. Okay. Laura.
Okay. So is this on? Yeah, the interesting thing about Bildung, it's all over the paper, but I didn't actually use the word because it's very hard to translate and it would require another paragraph of a 20-minute talk. But this notion of cultivation and erudition that would sort of filter down to the German people, that came out of reforms by Schinkel's patron, one of his early patrons, Wilhelm von Humboldt, which reorganized the German education system with gymnasia based on sort of the study of the classics. But I think what interests me about studying the bureaucratization of architecture is that Bildung is sort of a top-down, but by creating a bureaucratic system, you've got to contend with bottom-up. And that's what Schinkel's trying to do. And I think on one level, I don't think he's a champion of, the working class, as it were. But I do believe he knows he's fighting against the grain. And that style could be chosen from a spectrum of historical periods, and sort of the age of universals had ended, by and large. And so I think he's trying to sort of understand the local conditions in which he's working, but also do the best to sort of, put it back in the box, as it were. And I think another thing to remember is at this time, after 1815, we think now we look at Prussia through our eyes sitting here in 2019, but in 1815, it was anybody's guess if it was going to be Austria or it was going to be even Bavaria. Was it going to be Prussia? Who was going to take the mantle of, uniting the German-speaking lands, if that even could be conceived? And so the stakes were very high for having, the most cultivated citizenry one could have. And the area I looked at, my dissertation, the Rhineland, is 400 miles from Berlin. And so you wanted to make sure that you kept those people in church, and they, everything was going to. You kept the cover on everything, so to speak, at a distance. So there's a lot going on here, certainly. But at the end of the day, I think what surprises me is the adeptness with which provincials could kind of push back on Bildung a little bit as sort of a larger framework.
Yeah, no, I suppose this partly, that's all interesting and to the point for sure. I think the thing I was thinking partly of also is how, like, the architectural imagery of Bildung, to the extent that we, project it perhaps onto certain designs, often has to do with stairways and plateaus and stairways and plateaus and views, like, Gillies Friedrich Denkmal, or this famous stair at the entrance of the Altes Museum by Schinkel. And the sense in which the memorandum of 1835 seems to kind of put the ball in the court of the provincial architects says, I'm not going to spoon feed you, you're going to have to struggle up this difficult hill yourself, but that is how you become a citizen in a sense.
Right. And to that point, for him, much to the king's consternation, the king was like, well, this isn't going to save me money. I want to know how to do this cheaply. But for him, for Schinkel, is exactly to your point, the way to have better citizens was to have good buildings that then somehow they would kind of, it would spread. It would be ennobled. It had to be a good building, and by being in the presence of a good building, it would raise everybody up. Mm-hmm. And he was a huge fan of a view, and his own buildings. Yeah. But he realized that he couldn't control it all, and they were going to have to learn for themselves.
As always, it comes down to, well, what do you mean by good? But let's open this up to other questions. I should put my glasses on so I can see people. I see somebody there. Oh, it's Alex. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for those excellent talks. I just want to ask a brief question of each person in turn, and so to maximize the amount of time for everyone else to ask questions. So for Ambra, I was fascinated by this correlation you drew between the mosaics and then the pantomime and so on. But the question that then would occur to me in view of the equivalence you established is where do the paintings, where do they become self-conscious about their difference from pantomime, or do they, or do they episodically, and if so, what does that look like?
Well, it's an interesting question because some scholars are now working on pantomime on the literature side, not on the art historian side. They all claim how you cannot look at them as a scene that is happening. And in fact, none of them is wearing a mask, for instance. So you cannot think about this painting as a representation of something that exactly was on stage, but they influenced the iconography. So my claim is not so much about what they represent, of what you would have seen, but how they influence the motif that you could have seen.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think to me it's interesting to think about what is self-referentially pictorial in the paintings, such that they acknowledge their difference in those moments, which is different from iconography and influence and so on. But perhaps we could talk about that afterwards. So, Patricia, I just wondered about. I detected some emotion in your voice when you said towards the end, that with these replicas now, it's as though the Opium Wars never took place. And so there's obviously a stake you have in the erasure of the historical past, which is so gruesomely clear in these amusement parks. And it leads me to this question. Do you describe the ruins in your dissertation? And if so, what are the pros and cons of such descriptions?
I think the emotion you may have heard was actually just my voice getting tired towards the end of a 20-minute
So you have
talk.
no emotion about that?
I'm born here in Los Angeles. I have very little emotional connection to the Opium Wars other than as a research topic and the way in which it informs this historical framing of the way China thinks about its quote-unquote century of humiliation. And actually the site of the Yuanmingyuan itself is considered a site of patriotic education, where school children are brought there to learn about this history of humiliation that the nation has suffered. And this rhetoric of national humiliation is still very much in play in contemporary China, in the way they think about their relationship with the rest of the world. As to the other part of your question about description of the ruins themselves, they are absolutely will be part of the dissertation. And in the dissertation itself, I will go more into the way in which the form of the ruins is informing these debates about whether or not it is appropriate to reconstruct it. Because then there's a whole conversation to be had about the development of appreciation for a ruin aesthetic among Chinese intellectuals versus the desire to restore a glorious Qing imperial past.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and then Laura, just this is a somewhat abstruse but still direct question. It's just, I think about, I have this phrase in here, the provinces of the self, and I was just thinking of childhood in a romantic context as being a province of the self, kind of uncouth and vulgar, but withal in a developmental sense, ideally moving towards decorum and grace and proportion and symmetry and everything. So it just made me wonder about Schinkel's own biography and his own childhood, if he ever talked about any moments where he himself was provincial to himself, provincial to the portrait that showed up frequently in your talk, which would never give us a sense of anything other than utter urbanity in the man and his entire life, yet presumably he too once was a provincial.
That's an interesting point. He actually was from a town called Neuruppin, which is outside Berlin. And when he was a small boy, he was about 7, there was a fire that destroyed the city and he killed his father, who was helping to fight the fire. His mother through help, got him to a good gymnasium, a good school in Berlin, a very well-known one. But he required the patronage of people to be able to travel to Italy to make his, grand tour trip. So that's an interesting point that you make, because he always, he certainly reached the very highest, the pinnacle of his profession.
Yeah.
But he did come from a modest background, and he, I think about it just sometimes. Obviously, it's not part of my dissertation in any way, shape, or form, but I wonder what it was like for him to witness as a child the rebuilding of his town. That certainly was had to have been a defining part of his upbringing.
Yeah, and to me, where that is brought to bear a little bit is in his otherwise just, I guess, sort of simply magically rational revision of his 1827 view in 1835. In other words, I was thinking there must be some deep basis for his ability to change his mind.
A part of it as well, I think, is, and that's a really interesting point. He also, though, in the reports, he's very concerned about the architectural profession as such, which may also get back to this idea of his, his own sort of his identity. But the architectural profession itself is in a moment where you have this rise of engineering, of course, the engineering profession, and you also then have, he's dealing with a lot of masons and carpenters who are not trained. And he's very keen on training. He's very active in the Bau Academy in Berlin, and he builds, of course, the seminal building for the Bau Academy. And he feels very strongly about education, and but a certain architectural professionalism is very important to him, in defending his profession from, as he sees the ineptitude. I mean, he's very critical in his writings about masons and carpenters who haven't been trained, who don't have Bildung or a classical background, don't know how to draw, don't know math. But then he also wants to talk about the technological side, because he feels impinged upon by the rise of civil engineering. So he's at a really interesting moment in architecture as a profession as well, I think, which is also working into some of this too. Yeah.
Thank you, all three of you, for this fascinating panel. I think it all really comes together. And in fact, it strikes me that in all three papers, there is a kind of running tension in very different ways between the body and the type and their role in forming both architectural space, but also its afterlives in a way. And the question I'm going to ask is specific to Laura's project, but it's something that perhaps might open up for the other papers as well. Laura, I was very struck and appreciative of the fact that as you had this slide up between the 1827 template and the 1835 memorandum, you made this wonderful point of style now being located in proportion. And for me, proportion is about the regulation of part to whole that is felt, actually, that it is based on a kind of integrated body, whether it is of the individual human body or maybe the social body, which is, I was very appreciative that you made that extrapolation, and how that operated in tension with the type or typology. And perhaps this isn't so much a question, it's more of a provocation for added thought to think across these three papers, because it seemed also in Patricia's paper, I kept thinking of miniaturization and scale, as opposed to, say, proportion in the ways that it might have been for Schinkel, that something is different about miniaturization than, say, ways we might think of in terms of classical proportion. But nevertheless, this bodily experience of these replicas being somehow just this kind of incredible phenomenon of showing these absolutely individual European monuments and proposing them as types. So it just seems to me that there might be some dialogue that could be formed there if there's something that is, if that tension between, say, the body and the type, or architecture as symbol, as almost a kind of writing, right? That to me is what the template or the type is, and this more proprioceptive, felt, embodied kind of way in which we can conceive of architecture. Is that something that might be useful for all three of these projects in some way? So that's just my thoughts.
Thank you. That's a really wonderful point that you made. Yeah, absolutely. He even says, this is too pretentious, And having visited a lot of these small churches, thank you. It was really resonant for me. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Sorry. No, I was thinking through the question about this relationship between the body and the miniature. And I'm thinking about like my own bodily experience of these sites of when you're in splendid China, and there's a lot of like stooping down and trying to look and feeling very amazed at all these little tiny pieces that create a very exquisite piece of architecture populated by little clay figures as well. And the miniatures, in some ways, it is so much more delightful than the monumental, because then you go to Handian with these monumental, essentially like a filming location, and it's all very clumsy, actually, and the interiors of these spaces don't really match what they're presenting to you on the outside, which in some ways, I mean, if it is going to be used as a film set, is perfectly logical, but then your bodily experience is very, very odd, because you're expecting one set of experiences, and then you walk in through a doorway, and you're in a completely different kind of space.
Ambra, did you want to say anything on this topic, or are you okay?
Well, in my personal case, for paintings, they are really different in size. There is really a variety, so it's very hard to come up with like a pattern, also of size. The painting with Achilles and Agamemnon and Achilles and Skyros, those are really big. Those are like at least as tall as 1.20 meters. So pretty impressive. The Tablinum, too, there was a room pretty large in that space, but also those are really pretty impressive. Like you cannot, not look at them, for sure. You're confronted with that. And that, I think, what also brought later scholars to focus too much on the presence of Achilles per self, and trying to see in this figure something related absolutely to the Patronus, because it was there that he would have seated with his clients. But, around Achilles, there were also Agamemnon and Athena and Odysseus and Deidameia, half naked, who is missing there. So it's, I think, also in that case, because also we're left with just Achilles, in both of them, basically, that also what plays, a part in that size, too. Like, this is fragmentary, and so it's, that also what affected, I think, the modern understanding of those paintings and the space in which they were found. But we need to look at them in their own fuller space and how they would have looked like, but interesting.
Other questions?
Yes, thank you all. The thread that I seem to identify between your three papers is how malleable the past is to the needs of the present, either the myths that are interpreted in various ways, or the glories of the past reconstructed, or styles of the past readjusted, or local traditions also continued. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts or reflections on that. And then I have a more specific question for Laura, and I'm very unfamiliar with your time period, so what I say might be totally off. But this operation of creating kind of cookie-cutter churches for the territory, does it also have to do anything with the idea of wanting to project a unified identity? You mentioned that there is this project of unifying the German-speaking areas, and it reminded me a bit of what the Ottoman Empire was doing, where they were sending plans for mosques that were, of course, very grand, but they were all a kind of adjustment on Hagia Sophia, which was the famous Byzantine church turned into a mosque, and they were all over the empire. So it's another kind of creating a homogeneous identity for the territory. And then the other thought that I was having was, this is also the time of the Industrial Revolution, with production that is now cookie-cutter in some ways. So I wonder if also that context has anything to do with this project, and also your architect's reaction to it later on, like seeing the problems with this homogenization. So thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of the Industrial Revolution, it's a little bit early here. Schinkel's funny. He, one of the provincial architects wants to use iron, and he's like, no, can't possibly do that. It's too expensive, and we don't know if its strength is going to, be adequate for the vault. So it at that point is a little bit early for him. But the point about unifying is interesting. I don't think it's I don't think it's clearly not outside Prussia, but and these are state-sponsored, public architecture, but they're also, the person who's sponsoring them is a devoutly Protestant king who has written his own liturgy. He wants to combine the Lutheran and Calvinist arms and create a German Protestant church. So that's driving this. There's a real desire for the king to sort of have a unified presence for the Protestant church throughout his lands. And there's also a concern to have too many Catholic churches anywhere. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of political sort of, many political imperatives behind it, definitely. But I would like to talk to you more about the mosque plans afterwards, actually. I think that would be really, I'd like to learn more about that. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
And as to your comment about the importance of the past and the present, in working on this theme park chapter, I mean, there have been a lot of scholarship about theme parks, especially like now that we're in LA, Disneyland as being a theme park that is actually really about American cultural heritage, the imagined American past and the imagined American future, from Frontierland to Adventureland to Tomorrowland. And so it's quite interesting to then think about these theme parks in China as having this pedagogical purpose of trying to, in some ways, the theme park itself is presenting an argument of like what is a part of China and what isn't, which of course in contemporary politics is quite a loaded question. Is the Potala Palace in Tibet part of Chinese cultural heritage? Are objects that are looted from the Yuanmingyuan a space that was made for a Manchu ruling house? They're not Han Chinese as an ethnic group, designed by Jesuits. Is that a piece of Chinese cultural heritage? And so what has been interesting to me about my project is like trying to think through all of these questions that not just those of us working in Chinese art history are thinking about, but I think many of us in the museum field as well.
Did you want to say something?
Can I say something?
You look like you were getting ready to, so please do.
No, I think it's very important to talk about how the past is malleable, especially, if you work on something that was made 2,000 years ago. And especially, I show some images that were considered for many, since the 70s, pornographic. For instance, Eros, love was not the, how we think about that. So it took, decades before to go back on these, paintings and try to look at them in their own specific context. And the same for Eros can be said for humor. Like in the ancient time, for instance, they loved having this farcical execution where people were dressed like Icarus and, with fake wings and like be splatter on the ground, and people would have loved that. They would have laughed. To us, it's horrific, this. So it's fascinating and at the same time very hard to look at these paintings because you have to think with not your modern mind, but with their 2,000 years ago mind. So it's the challenge and what makes fun, I think, my field also.
Yeah, I think Mary has a question.
Early on in Ambra's talk, she used this phrase about a common visual vocabulary and then linked it to notions of democratization. And then as I listened to Patricia's talk, I was so struck by how a garden framework that was absolutely the antithesis of democratization then has turned into the thing that can be miniaturized, owned. It's actually free now, and you can go to the fish restaurant on the back if you can pay the fee. And then how Laura has taken us into a kind of a certain kind of aspiration to a democratization of a religious practice. I have no idea what the seating was like in those churches, but presumably the rich people sat in front and the poor people sat elsewhere, but maybe not so much. But in picking up these themes across your papers, my question is really, do you have a sense that this is an area of inquiry that is being pushed and surfacing right now in architectural, historical journals, conferences? Is this a new interest? Is it a desire to actually look at and say, well, in the late 19th century, when someone was looking at the Roman plan of these particular houses in Pompeii, they were actually thinking of Golden Age equivalent merchants in London and New York. So they had to have a place that was theirs. To what degree are these questions particularly current, do you think, in the beginning of the 21st century?
It is, I think, yes. I think it is a new trend in my field, and especially the problem with art, houses, is that scholars that works on houses that don't work on sub-elite spaces and inns and food and drinks, outlets. Now is a new trend. People are starting to actually think that it's not just, as I say, the matter of aspiration of luxury. This is not what people wear. This is everywhere. So the professor I'm working in Pompeii, Stephen Ellis, he just published his own book on taverns across the Roman Empire, and is actually pointing out that these were spaces that where everyone went, even the richest or the poorest. And these were spaces that were found even luxurious. Sometimes in these counters at Pompeii, you have very precious marbles. So that shows that this is, again, so sort of, talking about democratization in this way, that it's everywhere, that it's part of their, common heritage and language. And that's what I try to go with the paintings too, in the same direction. So I think, definitely coming from that system and working with Stephen too, helped to also develop this kind of idea, and especially working on inns. I always worked for the past, 15 years on houses, and now I look at, totally different spaces. In the area where we are, there is not even one house. It's just inns and stables. So it really opens up new questions when you start to look outside your own box, definitely.
Yeah, I absolutely think that we in the 21st century are in this moment of thinking quite heavily about spaces of privilege and spaces of public access, especially in the Bay Area, where public space is at a premium right now. And there's been many conversations about whose space is the public park for.
Here too.
Yes, absolutely. And so certainly it's that larger theme, I think, is quite pertinent to our current moment. Within the context of the Yuan and Chinese history, I mean, this is also a conversation that's happening in the early 20th century after the fall of the dynasty, where you start to see these Qing imperial spaces that were formerly quite closed off and accessible only to a very privileged few, transform into public spaces. That now, the Forbidden City is a museum that you can tour through. And actually in sort of the one of the reasons why the Yuan was burned down actually comes down to a question of access to the Qing Empire, that Europe really wanted to push trade, and the Qing said you can only trade in the port of Canton. And so we marched, the Western powers marched an army north and burned down the Emperor's Garden as sort of a message. And one of the participants in that, in his memoirs, there's this quote that I read. He said that as in terms of how it relates to art, it was an act of vandalism, but as an act of statecraft, it was brilliant.
I think for my area, yes, I agree with your point that this is a moment, but my work is very much influenced by the work of architectural historian Dell Upton, who's writing, 30 years ago and is still writing and it's still informing my work, and as well as studies of vernacular architecture, where we wanted to get away from just looking at the design of one person as if they existed in a vacuum, but instead looking at buildings as social processes with many different actors and stakeholders. So I agree that there's a moment now where we are interested in and I think it's across art history, in uncovering, getting away from sort of just an elite kind of view of how objects were used or space is used. But I would say that for me, it goes back into the late 20th century, and that kind of work from the 80s and 90s. His book on Anglican churches, for example, is to me a master study in how to read a building as a societal process.
So it's just about 3:30. Should we take one more, or should we call it a day? We do have time for one more, if anybody has a late ripening question. There you go, yes.
Thank you so much for your rich papers. I have a question specific to Patricia. I'm wondering, beside the top-down design agendas, narratives, and the bodily experience from the perspective of a researcher, I'm wondering in your larger dissertation topic, where you consider any ethnographic studies on the reception of these theme parks by local communities of diverse social background across generations? Thank you.
Thank you. That is actually a great question, and maybe one that I would pursue in a book project later, because I'm trying to keep it from becoming a social history or an anthropological or purely anthropological work, but that's certainly something for future research to go into. Thank you.
Well, join me in thanking the panelists.
And our moderator as well. Thank you. Please join us for a coffee break out in the lobby, and we'll reconvene in a half an hour at 4 o'clock.